Welcome to Art 305, Art and Mass Culture. Art and Mass Media is an ebook written by Betty Ann Brown in 2005. It will be available to you on Canvas, so you don't need to purchase a book for this class. Most students download the book chapter by chapter onto their computers and read it that way. You can also print it out, but be aware that it is about 500 pages long. This book discusses mass or popular culture. Because the textbook was written in 2005 and has never been updated, some of the references will seem a little bit dated to you. There are also some errors in the book that I will try to alert you to. And I will update the material by providing you with video and text links to watch and read. Preface. In this illustrated lecture, I will go over the main points in the preface of the book. The preface of a book introduces a book, typically stating its subject, scope, or aims. In the preface to this book, Dr. Brown explains why she wrote this book. She says, quote, "While many art historians continue to focus on what early modern critics called disinterested aesthetic issues, increasing number of scholars have turned to an examination of the politics of representation. Instead of analyzing artworks as separate from social forces, they have begun to interrogate the impact of race, gender, class, sexuality, and colonialism on art making. In asking how cultural context has affected and sometimes determined the nature of image production, they have revealed previously obscured aspects of art's history and significance. And you will recognize that many of these issues are still being discussed today, particularly when we think about marginalized communities like Black and Brown communities, LGBTQ communities, and even social inequalities for women." Dr. Brown's goal, she says, quote, "My goal in revising this text is to offer students critical tools they can employ in their ongoing encounters with the highly visual mass media." And she lets us know that she relied on the work of many theoreticians, critics, and philosophers to write this book. She says, "In this preface, I want to highlight those theorists whose works have shaped this writing most directly." She goes on to say, "While many of their names will reappear in the text, it is only here that I fully acknowledge their influence and summarize how their thought has contributed to visual literacy, that is, the critical study of art and popular culture images." The first theoretician we're going to look at is Marshall McLuhan. Let's look at some of the theoreticians Dr. Brown mentions in the preface of her book. Marshall McLuhan, who is perhaps most famous for his idea that the medium is the message, and for his idea of making and matching. The artwork that we're going to look at are some Sumerian figures and Doryphoros of a sculpture by Polykleitos, an ancient Greek sculptor. McLuhan analyzed the historical development of communication forms, from oral and pictographic through manuscript, print, and electronic media. What? Marshall McLuhan was interested in the ways that information and knowledge get communicated from one person to the next in different societies throughout history. For instance, before written language was invented, people had to tell each other any important information, called oral communication, so by speaking. Or they could draw pictures, pictographs, send smoke signals. But before written language, the way people communicated was very different than it is today. Then, once pictographs or written language with symbols instead of an alphabet were invented, information could be written down by one person and read by many other people. So, communication changed radically. Instead of having to tell someone everything they needed to know, a person could read the information on a wall or on a manuscript. And for McLuhan, once that medium of communicating information changed, so did society. When the printing press was invented and books could be printed instead of handwritten, then society changed again. How did electronic media change things? Once again, Marshall McLuhan was interested in the ways that knowledge and information get communicated from one person to the next in different societies through history. In other words, for McLuhan, the medium of communication, say a book versus a television set, had a huge impact on society and the way people think and act in society. Once electronic media was invented, where we see information on a screen instead of reading a book, so think television, then human perception was changed in a radical way. McLuhan felt that art and artists help people to understand how to perceive or understand all of the new images that they had to deal with on a daily basis. What is an artist? Artists help us understand how the world is affected by new technology or media like the internet or social media. Now, of course, the internet and social media weren't invented before Marshall McLuhan died, but his writing can be applied to that, and he predicted the internet before he died in 1980. All right, so let's look at the idea of making versus matching. And again, this is another important concept from Marshall McLuhan. McLuhan discussed pictographic writing like the cuneiform of ancient Iraq, then the cultural shift from making to matching that has begun in ancient Greece and further developed in the Renaissance. In other words, whether we communicate with books, a written alphabet, or television or the internet or social media, viewing images and text on a screen, we are most concerned with looking at things rather than any other sense. When people communicated orally before written language, we were most concerned with hearing information. The Sumerians invented one of the first written languages. McLuhan theorized that as our focus of communication shifted from speaking to each other to reading language, the ways that artists envisioned the world also shifted. When the visual sense is played up above all other senses, it creates a new kind of space and order that we often call rational or pictorial space and form. When we emphasize vision or seeing above all of our other senses, like hearing, smell, taste, or touch, that leads the artist to want to match the environment they see around them. This emphasis on vision leads artists to want to portray rational or pictorial space in their artworks. If artists help us understand the most important aspects of the way we communicate with each other, reading or seeing text, then they try to portray the world that they see with their eyes accurately and naturalistically. You can see the difference between making and matching in art if you compare the image of the standing male figure from ancient Sumer with a standing male sculpture from ancient Greece. By the time ancient Greek society had evolved, their culture was much more based on written language than the Sumerians had been. So ancient Greek artists emphasized a more naturalistic or realistic depiction of the human form than the Sumerians had. As you look at these sculptures, which ones seem to match our visual reality more? Is it the Sumerian figures or the Greek sculpture? As you look at these figures, which one seems to match our visual reality more? The Sumerians or the Greek sculpture? Here they are in close-up. All right, so once again, for McLuhan, the way people communicate shapes the way artists portray their environment. When communication changed from oral traditions, speaking to one another to communicate, to writing information down, the ways that artists communicated with their audiences also changed radically. Artists went from making artworks to trying to match their visual environment, making art that looked more realistic or naturalistic. The ancient Greeks were much more dependent on written communication than the Sumerians, and so their artwork looked much more realistic than the Sumerians. When communication became dependent on electronic screens, the ways that artists communicate with their audiences again changed radically.